Recent figures by the Centers for Disease Control show that the United States is failing when it comes to preventing infant mortality, falling behind 25 industrialized nations. While most look at prenatal care or the lack thereof as the reason for infant deaths, research shows that the period after the child is born is where more attention needs to be placed. So, based on the Centers for Disease Control, a study in 2014 showed that over 23,000 infants died in their first year of life in the United States. As I said, this is behind 25 other industrialized nations. And generally, people will talk about premature deaths as the reason why that number is so high. But even if you factor out all of those premature deaths, the United States is still failing. But it's interesting because you might look at prenatal care as the reason why there would be either premature births or infant mortality. But there are several different studies that say that might not necessarily be the case, at least in the United States. Of course, there is a racial component. Generally speaking, white, non-Hispanic folks, there's 5 deaths for every 1,000 births. For black individuals, it's closer to 11 per 1,000 births. So there is that component. There's other factors, including the fact that mothers either under 20 years old or over 40, they have a higher chance. The first babies born in a family have a higher chance of dying. And then some figures actually say that unmarried mothers have more than 70% higher chance of having infant mortality there. Of course, a couple of studies looked at, there were 17 different studies that said that additional care or the quality of care is not necessarily associated with premature births or infant mortality. So I think what was interesting to me about this point is that I would assume that if you have higher quality care or if you have more frequent prenatal visits, that would affect that, or that you would probably have a healthier baby, but it's not necessarily clear what that is. It looks like the biggest reason is within the first month to the first year of a child being born, specifically with accidents or sudden infant death syndrome. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But
what are the factors for sudden infant death syndrome? But that's just the luck of the draw, is it not?
Right. I mean, and that's, I think, what's so interesting to me about this is there's not a lot of, I thought there would be more specific reasons as to why or, what leads to sudden infant death syndrome. There's certain things, even, for example, placing the child on its back versus on its stomach.
Right, that's the biggest one. And that was always, the interesting thing was that probably that wasn't only known in the last 10 to 15 years. So it's certainly for me, and arguably for you, probably when you were a baby, your parents were certainly told, put the baby on the back, because that's what we were told. So that's obviously now been refuted because it leads to SIDS.
Right.
Or is a huge contributory factor towards SIDS. So if you don't do that, the rest of it is just from what my understanding is.
Luck of the draw. I mean, of course, when you're talking about accidents or what have you, I mean, many of these, the researchers here, they suggest that there should be more at-home nursing visits once the child is born. But that to me has more to do with accidents. For example, you're taking care of the child as opposed to the SIDS. So that's why I was curious, especially because the United States, we're supposed to have some of the best medical care and the highest technology. Of course, we're seeing certainly in the past 10 years or so that's not necessarily the case. So yeah, I mean, this is an interesting study to look at this information. I'm not sure, besides basically throwing money at the problem or throwing more money at each infant to whether it's education or whether it is having these at-home nursing visits, what exactly is going to fix this problem. But I was a little bit disheartened. But what do you guys think? Why do you suppose the United States has such a high infant mortality rate?